no matter what your favorite competitive hobby is, there exists some form of event meant to test your skill. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Championship Series events create the partition that divides the good players from the great players. Topping a YCS requires a combination of focus, skill, knowledge, wit, and a little bit of luck to achieve. In this series of standalone think pieces, I'll be sharing my own journey with you, detailing my perspectives on various aspects of the game in an effort to expand my knowledge and document my own Yu-Gi-Oh! Journey in an effort to, well, top a YCS. In a typical game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, paired players sit across from each other at a table, take out their mats and deck boxes, give a dull greeting to one another, then prepare their decks to play the game. But what actually affects the outcome of that game? What factors decide who wins or loses the match? How much of it is skill? What does skill even mean in a systematic game like Yu-Gi-Oh? Do the players have more control than they think? There's this concept I'm dubbing the 4 pillars of Yu-Gi-Oh, and they tell us exactly what human input affects the outcome of the game. Today we'll be covering exactly what these 4 pillars are, why they're so important, what they mean, and how to apply them to your own play. All in an effort to become better players, and eventually, to top a YCS. In Patrick Hoban's book, Road of the King, Hoban outlines these 4 pillars in an excerpt that reads as follows. In a tournament, players within a system of rules make choices that dictate the outcome of the tournament, developing more and better choices by manipulating the factors influencing the outcome of the tournament with respect to the system of rules, the hierarchical tournament structure, then matches, then games, and the limited control an individual can exert is influenced by an individual's play, the other people's play, the individual's deck, and the other players' decks. Studying, exploiting, and improving upon properties of the areas that we influence are all just part of the same thing, the option to play the tournament. An extract that may sound incredibly pretentious at first and seems to have a lot of fluff thrown in actually tells us exactly what both players have domain over. As a player, there are 4 human inputs that can change the outcome of a match. An individual's play, the other people's play, the individual's deck, and the other players' decks. The tip of an iceberg that may seem simple at first, however, the deeper we look, the more vast and insightful these pillars become. If we take this into more modern terminology, we can identify that the individual's play is simply technical play. The player's impact on the game state via their choices through how they sequence their plays, manage resources, prioritize threats, and play around private knowledge. This one's pretty obvious. If you don't know you should attack your own Lost World token because you're afraid of an Ash Blossom, then your technical play is bottlenecked by your lack of game knowledge. If you don't already know, the sequence that triggers caused by Lost World saving the token is entirely in damage step, when Ash Blossom cannot be activated, of course. From playing around back row, to knowing how to use your disruption against your opponent's deck, from choosing whether you go for game and play into Nibiru, or play it safe and set up more resources for next turn, all of that is part of this first pillar. However, a commonly overlooked aspect of technical play is the ability to deduce exactly what cards your opponent may have face down or which hand traps they do or do not have. Let's look at an example. If I normal summon Rescue Cat and attempt to activate its effect, it will send itself to graveyard for cost, and threaten to summon out 2 beast monsters from my deck. In the current format, most know how big of a threat Rescue Cat is if it resolves, and they will either chain Ash Blossom or Gamma. Otherwise, they may use Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence on the summon of the cat, so that if you choose to activate its effect, it will resolve negated, which is usually the safer alternative, as it doesn't play into an opposing Gamma as much. So what happens if Rescue Cat resolves here? Well, I can deduce that it's very unlikely that my opponent has any of these 4 cards. It acts as a way to check what they have without actually looking at their hand. Bear in a minimum 3 of the 4, since there are definitely times it makes sense to hold Ash Blossom compared to the others. A similar concept can be applied to almost any deck that runs draw power. Pot of Desires, Pot of Prosperity, Pot of Extravagance, etc. When you activate a card like Extravagance, if they don't use Ash Blossom, you can pretty confidently say that they don't have it. Now you might ask yourself, what if they hold the card and don't shotgun Disruption Rescue Cat? Well, in cases like this, the reason cutting off cards like Rescue Cat are valued highly is that it simply is less likely that they play through their starter getting hit than it is if you hold the disruption for later. This gets into complicated hypergeometric distribution stuff, so I won't go into too much detail, but just know that even if the disruption was more difficult to play through later, you're still giving them a loaded graveyard to set up their board and follow up turns. Of course, this doesn't apply to every single 1-card starter, but it does to Rescue Cat and Tri-Brigade, as well as many others. This is why technical play becomes so complex, because as humans we can't always calculate the exact probabilities of any board position like a chess AI, and figure out mathematically the best response to every game state. However, we are capable of learning over time, reviewing our technical mistakes, crunching the numbers in hindsight, and learning these small interactions for future reference. Another way of deducing your opponent's cards is to ask yourself when you believe they would have used a certain card, or if they would have sequenced their hand differently if they had a specific card. A great example of this would be in Shadal Dogma Invoked. If your opponent goes first and starts with Nadir Servant, for example, you can pretty quickly deduce that they do not have Magical Meltdown or a way to Alistair, since otherwise they would go for that play first to protect the Nadir Servant so it could resolve. Similarly, this is also how you can assess a player's skill in the game, of course. If you see them activate Nadir first, get Ash Blossomed, then activate Magical Meltdown afterward, you can see that they prioritize getting to Mechaba more than going +3 off of Nadir, which most people would agree is incorrect to do. For the second pillar, things immediately get extra complex. Hoban cites the next input as the other people's play. This seems to be hinting at your opponent's technical play, but since the original excerpt is speaking from the perspective of a player's own input, and because he goes into more detail about this idea later on, we know that he's referring to how you can influence your opponent's play, otherwise known as the mental game. This is a concept in just about every sport, but in Yu-Gi-Oh! It's particularly complex as this game is systematic. In theory, one could be immune to any form of mental mind games if they were simply to ignore their opponent. However, humans are more complicated than that, and most of the time the information you can gain from your opponent's behavior is too valuable to ignore. From start to end, the match itself is a mental game. Humans are imperfect, and we love to take risks when we're feeling incredibly angry, frustrated, exhausted, or confident. Knowing how to affect your opponent while staying within the system of the game's rules and Konami policy is a skill of its own. Due to the rules, you cannot outright lie to your opponent or misrepresent the game state to them. This means you can't say, "I don't have Nibiru," and then Nibiru them as soon as they play into it. This can result in penalties issued by a judge. That's not the mental game. You can, however, say something completely subjective. Make gestures or speak in a way to suggest that your hand isn't ideal, to bait your opponent into taking more risks, for example. The idea of a good hand is purely subjective, and while it's deceptive nonetheless, especially if you open insane but you still feign that you have a bad hand, it's well within the game's tournament rule set. If you are aware of your opponent's habits, for instance, notice their reactions when they draw well versus when they draw poorly, watch their eyes and notice where their focus currently is, you can glean a lot more information than you would by ignoring all those aspects. Inversely, you can use those human tells to your advantage. If you know one of your own tells, say you always fan out your graveyard when you've drawn a Reborn type card, you can lean into it. Always ask your opponent if they have anything in their graveyard before you use one, then later do the same thing, trying to bait them into holding a ghost spell, for instance. How can this be useful though? What does conditioning them net you gameplay-wise? Realistically, it can be broken down to designate what cards you need to resolve to win the game, and condition your opponent to thinking you need other cards to resolve to win the game. The mental game is genuinely one of the deepest aspects of Yu-Gi-Oh! That I really can't do justice in one video, so we're gonna move on. The third pillar would be the individual's deck, according to Hoban. Naturally, this is referring to deck building. Of course players have control over this, as it's usually what most card games are advertised to be about. Yu-Gi-Oh! Takes this a step further than most, however, and allows you to select and use cards from any card ever printed outside of the cards on the current ban list. This is where I believe many players have a major misunderstanding about the game though, especially competitively. They may lose a match they feel they played to their best ability, and resort to blaming luck. However, the deck building aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is so unbelievably complicated. Since you can use cards from such a large card pool, every single card has its upsides and downsides. Now obviously, not all cards are created equally. However, that doesn't mean that the worst archetypes have no upside at all compared to the modern meta decks. The best example of this that I can think of is Mystic Mine. This card's upside is pretty obvious. Stall out the game so you can set up a turn where you win before they can out the card. Seems fine on paper until you look at most meta decks and see that the vast majority don't play more than 1, maybe 3 maximum outs to the card. And many more play 0 outs in the main deck. This creates a conundrum where the card is as relevant as the number of outs people are main decking. The more they play, the worse it is. The less they play, the better it is. Its upside becomes incredible when it's literally a win button where you deck out your opponent since they have nothing to stop it. This also has extra value in decks that don't play a lot of back row anyway. In those types of decks, you can side Mystic Mine, bring it in against matchups that you know aren't going to have back row hate against you, or that will side out back row hate, slam it on the field and then see what happens. Uninteractive card design aside, I mentioned Mystic Mine because there will be many times in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you lose to something archaic or old that you've never heard of or thought you would never play against. Even a deck like Gravekeepers can play both Necro Valley and Royal Tribute and leave you with basically 0 plays in some decks if they open well. But Gravekeepers isn't meta, so why would you prepare for it? Well, you probably wouldn't, that's not the point. The point is that those cards have unique upsides that, given enough time, will pay off for that player, and sometimes you're on the receiving end of that payoff. There's a lot more cards like this, and this is one of the reasons why deck building can be more complicated than you think. Mathematically, there is a theoretical best deck that would give you the absolute maximum chance of winning among all of the meta decks. I don't just mean the deck choice either. I mean card for card, there exists a deck that increases your win rate to the highest possible. However, due to formats only lasting 3 to 4 months, we simply don't have enough time to figure out what that deck is. When a player loses a game feeling they couldn't do anything different, sometimes the answer is their deck. Sometimes it's entirely the choice of which deck they decided to play, when they decided to play that deck, and the intricacies of the ratios of the card choices within that deck. That is why deck building matters so much. Moving on though, the fourth and final pillar is quoted as other players' decks. Once again, we're assuming Hoban is speaking from a single player's perspective on a tournament setting and not a group of players. This means he isn't implying how you could affect what cards the other players choose, but rather how their choices should affect your choices. This is otherwise known as the common concept of metagame. The metagame is typically what most discussion about a given format is about. What decks do you expect to play against? What tech choices will people be playing in those decks? What cards do you have to play around, and what cards can you disrespect and not play around? It all comes back to risks. The metagame affects the other three pillars the most, as being able to reliably guess what your opponents will be playing at any given event will affect how you build your deck, how you bait your opponent, and how you want to play out your turns. At the Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championships 2018, Boden Temnik spoke about why he chose to play Altergeist. He claimed that he did not want to play the perceived best deck, Goki, because the mirror would be popular and the mirror didn't consistently favor the better player enough. Altergeist had a good matchup against Goki, and both wasn't a common deck and wasn't considered a solved deck at the time. So there was a lot of ways to build it that might be unpredictable enough for him to win. It turns out though, this idea against the meta was not unique. And in fact, a large amount of the players at Worlds 2018 played Altergeist for the exact same reason. However, when Boden made it to the finals, his opponent was playing Trickstar, another control-focused deck that nobody expected to see at Worlds. It turns out he was one of the 2 players at the entire event playing Trickstar, and the reasoning was that while it had a decent matchup against Goki, not as good as Geist, it had a good matchup against Altergeist, the next best deck to beat, due to cards like Light Stage Stunning Back Row and Scapegoat creating tons of advantage. It could allegedly out-tempo Altergeist very quickly. Chia's prediction of what the meta would be like, seeing past playing Altergeist and playing the next best thing to beat both decks, ended up winning him his first World Championship, leaving Boden with a second place finish. Watching this happen live and seeing the deck profiles afterward where all of this was explained, is actually the primary thing that really motivated me to try to get into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! It's such a good example of how the metagame can really be turned on its head at any given tournament. How the psychology behind which deck you choose can actually be taken level upon level deeper and deeper. To round off this video, when 2 players sit down at a table to play Yu-Gi-Oh!, there are 4 pillars of player input that both players have on the game. Technical play, the mental game, deck building, and metagame. These 4 things are the human factors that can affect who wins a match in our favorite card game, and knowing about them and giving your attention equally can be what leads to becoming a better player. Now you might ask, how can I use the 4 pillars to my advantage and see some form of feedback or immediate improvement? My current answer to that is when you play a tournament and you win or lose a match, think about the reasons why. Try to designate one of these 4 pillars that you outplayed your opponent in. If you're consistently beating people because of your technical play, for instance, maybe it'd be a good idea to put more time and effort into the other 3. If you realize you're losing a lot because a lot of people are playing the deck that counters your deck, then maybe it's time to switch up decks before you play that tournament again. Doing things like this will create a feedback loop of sorts, where you can really see what your strong suits are and what your weaknesses are, what you need to improve and focus on, and what you don't need to. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you play any other card games, I'd love to hear about how this applies to them as well, or if you believe there are other factors not talked about here, other human inputs on the outcome of a match, that would be interesting as well. Feel free to comment below, I'll definitely leave a response, and thank you for stopping by.